Everyone, I would like to call the Board and Education and Business Committee meeting to order for Tuesday, October 24th. We acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. First item is the adoption of the agenda, and is there any additions or changes to the agenda? Can I move that? Thank you. Trustee DeGroot, second. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Minutes of the September 26, 2017 Board of Education meeting. Are you moving that? Sure. Seconding. Thank you. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Trustee Thorne is not able to join us tonight, and I believe Trustee Doman will be joining us shortly. Anything on the action list, Mr. Sandquist?
No outstanding items.
And as you're filling in for the superintendent, any comments about your action list?
It appears to be done.
Awesome.
Bob Yates, welcome.
Great, thank you. Well, first let me say it's always a pleasure to come back to the Cowichan Valley, warm land that it is, and to come back and revisit some of the work I've done. I always say these things, 5 years ago. Every time I say 5 years, it's probably 10 years. So, thank you very much. What I'm going to talk about today is firstly to talk a little bit about the changing demographics of the Cowichan Valley, what's happening here. We've got the 2016 census, although I think tomorrow we get the education data and some other data, income data. So we'll be able to, you'll be able to keep adding to that knowledge of how the valley is changing. And in particular, since the 2011 census wasn't a great one in terms of statistical terms for various reasons, it's great to be able to compare 2006 to 2016. 10 years is really a very interesting change. I'm going to talk a little about the enrollment projections it says 2019, there actually should be 2029, and beyond, because I think some of the changes are particularly interesting. Talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of housing and new development, and then the last item is really perhaps the most important, of bringing those ideas together with the impact of new class size, composition, etc., etc. So let's just move on to the changing demographics. So what's happening in the Cowichan Valley? There's really two forces which are at play here. The first one is what I call amenity migration. People are moving to the Cowichan Valley in the same way they are to Victoria, to the Comox Valley. It's the West Coast lifestyle, and it's primarily retirees and pre-retirees. For those of us who've reached a certain age and are still not retired, I guess I'm still in the pre-retirement. I'm not sure when that's ever going to happen. But it's also family age groups. So you can see that little bump there around 30 to 34, which we are seeing some young families move here, but primarily amenity migration is about that kind of 55 to 70 age group. But the other big long-term demographic shift which is occurring is still the progression of the boomers and their offspring. So the boomer generation, well, I can show you in more personal terms, there's that, front-end boomer, 1949. I won't even try and work out how old I am. And my daughter there, who was born in 1983, very much the echo of the boom. So boom, bust, echo, and born 2017. The echo of the echo. And I knew when I put that up there that someone would say, "Oh, how can we see your two ugly faces?" And my ugly face. So just there she is, 17 weeks old now. So, but that's that's the future. This is the class of graduating class of what, 2035. So when we put that into statistical terms, we end up with something which is much less attractive than her face, but is a whole series of charts. And there's a couple of things about this. The first thing is that little box down in the left-hand corner there, and the blue line is the 0 to 4 age group. So these are the kids who've been born in the 5 years prior to those dates, and you'll see what's happened over the last few years, kind of coinciding with every time I came here. It's a little up, then a little down, a little up, a little down. But you can see, and these are the figures from BC Stats. You can see that bottom line, that blue line, keeps going up, and that's because births are starting to creep up. The other thing which is of interest in this chart is that each of those lines for, the line above the blue line at the bottom is the 5 to 9. The line above that is the 10 to 14. The line above that at any one date is in fact the next 5-year age group. And what that tells us is that children are moving here. Families are moving here with their kids. And that's back to the other one. That's that movement into the valley. There's many factors involved there, but basically affordability of housing and this, various things are happening. But we continually get those kids moving in. In statistical terms, in terms of your enrollment, the way we project enrollment is really with two factors. Firstly, we want to know how many kindergarten kids there are, and that's related to the number of births. But the second is what we call retention ratios. So how many kids in kindergarten this year move into grade 1 next year, from grade 7 to grade 8? And we express those as around the number 1. So 1 is the same number of kids in kindergarten turn up in grade 1. So when you look at these numbers, you'll see that there's most of them, especially in the elementary age group, are over 1. So you've got the 4 zones and French immersion on the left. You've got the grades across the top. So each of those numbers tells you across the district as a whole that in fact we are gaining kids as we go through the grades. Except, of course, in French immersion, where we have a kind of a static number in kindergarten. We add a couple in grade 1, but after that, it's just a few kids who drop out each year as they decide that French immersion is not for them. When you get to the secondary age, because kids, you're still adding kids, but more kids are actually dropping out and moving into different places and all the rest of it. But basically, we are a district and a zone and a series of zones which, by and large, gain kids through the grades. There's a few anomalies there, which I really don't need to go into. A couple of the secondary schools which seem to pick up more grade 8 kids than there were grade 7 kids. We've got, and added into the mix, we've got Catholic schools, which and private schools which go to grade 6, schools which are in grade 7. The kids come to us in grade 8, and so various things going on there. But basically, that's the first part of it. That's the grade retention piece. The second part is how many kids are being born, because by and large, those are the number of kids we will be seeing 5 years later. Actually, 4 years later. The birth data is July. about that. You can see this is both actual. And you'll see that kind of stuttering up and down of the number of births over the last really going back to about 2000. But the projection is very much for it to continue rising. That's a very significant continual uptick in the number of births. And one of the interesting things, to say about this is that if births are still going up in 2030, it means your enrollment is going to continue going up to 2040. So what we're looking at here is a 20-year increase in the number of kids that you are going to be having in your school system.
Bob, can I ask a question?
Yes.
In 1996, we had a similar number of live births there compared to 2016.
Yep.
But we had that dramatic decline from 96 to 2001, and that was about the Asian flu time when there was this serious downturn in our economy, and there was a fundamental migration of people out of our resource industries to somewhere else. But the fact that it happened 20 years ago, why does that not equate into your projections going forward? Is this based on the economy consistently rising with?
Well, these are stats from BC Statistics.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly how they calculate that, but clearly there are some assumptions in here about the economy, and I would say that by and large all these projections are based on a continuation of current trends. I think when you go back to 1996, you can and you look at the Cowichan Valley economy, as you said, some significant changes in the number of how many schools were there around the lake, around Cowichan Lake in those days. There were probably half a dozen schools. It was half a million. Every community had 100 kids. Now that whole economy has changed. But so unless the economy changes markedly as going forward, your guess is as good as mine. My anticipation would be that those demographic trends, birth and retention ratios, I would see pretty much continuing. I can look back at the retention ratios, for instance, for the last 6 years. Those figures I just showed you are in fact averaged over the last 6 years. And during that period of time, they've gone up and down, but the average is pretty constant there. And certainly, I haven't gone back to 1996. We don't have that data. Thank you. But certainly, I think we're now at the point, where the number of births is going to continuously increase. And certainly this, I pulled off some figures for some of the other school districts, and these are the BC stats, and they do vary between school districts, but in some school districts you're going to see I was looking at West Vancouver where we've done some work, boy oh boy, a lot of pent-up demand there for kids, and it's going to impact significantly the school system. So in terms of just back to those numbers, don't worry about these numbers too much. But the interesting thing that here to me is that there's a lot of consistency between the number of births and the number of kindergarten kids 5 years later. So the numbers on the far right there are a rolling average of the ratio of births to enrollment, and it's about somewhere between kind of 85 and 90%. So where are the other kids going? Catholic schools, a slight, imbalance, between, between who's living here, when the child is born and who's, this is always different kids. But that pattern is pretty consistent. So in my projections, I've been using the figure of 90%, so taking those birth figures here and saying that the number of kindergarten kids 5 years later is going to be about 90% of that number. So that's what we got there. So just in terms of how that kind of ripples across the district, so over the past 5 years, distribution of kindergarten has been changing. We have seen, in the north zone there, which is the kind of the purple numbers up there, or the numbers outlined in purple, you can see it's gone from 10% to almost 15% of the total kindergarten kids in the district have ended up at those two schools of Chemainus and Crofton. So you've seen those enrollments increase. The number of French immersion kids has come down, and I don't quite know. We're dealing here with the number of kids, not the number of parents who want to register their kids, and that I think this year was 25, almost a quarter, 25% of the district kids were trying to get into French immersion because you capped it off. It's down to 16.8 there. So how this is changing. The figures in yellow are just the numbers that I've assumed, and with the births that I've assumed there becoming kindergarten, you can see that gives me a number of kindergarten kids in each of the zones. So this is as much as anything else telling you how I'm doing the projections and what the projections are based on. What does that turn into in terms of total enrollment? Well, a slow increase. No, not a slow increase. A steady increase from around just under 8,000 at the moment to just over 9,000. That's about a 12–14% increase over the next 10 years. But just bear in mind that I don't think that I've capped this off at 2029, but I think if you continued that, you'd see that there were we could possibly get close to 10,000 students by the time we get to 2040. So in terms of facility planning, when you come to that piece, that's where I would probably say don't plan for 10,000, but certainly plan for 9,500 in your discussions and arguments with the ministry over how big you should plan for schools. How does this change across the region? Oh, and those are just the actual numbers, but I'm not going to go into those at the moment. So in terms of the lake zone, that gives you a pretty good idea of how the enrollments on the lake zone have changed over the last 10, 12, 13 years. It's come right down. It used to be over 800. Now it's down to just over 400. Spread instead of spreading those 6 schools or whatever it was. Now in one elementary and one secondary. No significant change really. It's probably going to pick up a few more kindergarten kids, and it's probably going to hang on to the kids it's got through the grades. But that's not going to change the enrollment in this area very much. Slight growth, but very much manageable. A very different picture in the north zone. And I think the first thing to look at is how much the enrollment has increased over the last 4 years from 2014. A steady rise there, and I guess the question is, you know, so we've got always the projectionist's dilemma, you know. Yeah, I've got 4 years, it's going to go up. Is it going to continue going up for the next 10? Well, I think it probably is going to continue rising. I think there's a lot of factors which are driving it. I think housing is a little bit more affordable there. I think it's it's outside of this Victoria, what they call the commuting shed. Certainly in the south zones, a lot of people who drive over the Malahide, it's up, to Victoria, to General Hospital, for instance. But it's a lot farther from Chemainus to even to the General Hospital, off to Langford. So I think it's probably, keeps its kids a little bit more than some of those other areas. I think one of the issues here is the future of the Catholic school, St Jonas. There, my understanding from the principal is that there's some question marks around the continuation of that school, and certainly if that closes, there's some parents will clearly move their kids to Queen of Angels or one of the other Catholic schools, but I'm sure some will decide that the local school is just great.
Bob, another factor for the North End is that about 3 years ago, there was a closure of a dual-track school in the south end of Ladysmith, and I believe 30 students.
Right, Davis
Road, yeah.
Davis Road, yes.
Came to Chemainus.
Right, okay. Yes, and certainly you used to have a school at Mount Brent, yeah, that's right, yeah. Just, serving that kind of north area from there. But, it's certainly some leakage into the district, likely from there. So that's the north zone. To me, the interesting thing, is that in fact it's the elementary system which has really been growing over the last few years, and you can see that continuing to work its way through. So this increase here is of the elementary, primary and intermediate. After that, these kids move into the secondary system. So I think there's certainly going to be pressures that you need to address there, because certainly when I visited Chemainus, it's fascinating to see. I'll talk about that in a minute. Centre zone. It's interesting. It's pretty flat. Now, first thing to bear in mind is a lot more schools there. The scale on the left-hand side is significantly different from the last two. You've got a lot more kids. This is an increase from 2,800 to 3,200, something like that. I think the big question here is going to be around the policies of the municipality around affordable and rental housing, and the pace at which the somewhat confusing south end of North Cowichan, which is the north end of kind of here, the degree to which the zoning and the policies of the local government make housing affordable. And I think if indeed the development of, and we'll talk about housing in a bit more, if indeed some of those rental, mid-rise apartment complexes do come to fruition, and if that continues to be a policy of the North Cowichan district, then we could well see more kids come into this area. And the other question is around the pace of some of the more major developments. We'll talk a bit about the Bell McKinnon corridor in a few minutes. In the south, Well, very much steady growth over the last few years, likely continuing. Actually, I was surprised when I looked closely at this that the growth wasn't as fast as I kind of expected it to be. And that's largely, I think, because there's been a fairly consistent number of houses built over the last few years. So growth is kind of built into these figures here. If we do see a significant increase in that pace of growth, then we can see these figures go up a bit more. But a good part of the growth is in Kelsey in the secondary zones. Housing is more expensive there. We tend to see kids who are slightly older move into the area in secondary years. There's a whole bunch of questions. Yeah, but again, the pace of growth and its affordability is the major issue. And I guess the other question is French immersion, because this projection, you can see caps off French immersion. I think there's, if the interest in French immersion is waning slightly, or if you do decide you are not going to create more program space for French immersion, then clearly the number of kids in the program is going to stay pretty much the same. There's no capacity there. Historically, you've always catered to that demand. I think some of those policy issues, if all the other zones are demographically driven, this projection is policy driven. And if you decide that you're going to open a new school, then that French immersion will go up, and all the others will come down, because there aren't any new kids out there. There's, the number of kids in the district is, we're assuming it's not going to change enormously because you add a French immersion program. So what is happening with housing? This is CBRD data at the top. The blue line is electoral areas A, B, C, and D, which make up the majority of new housing starts in the area of CBRD, obviously outside of the city of Duncan and the district of North Cowichan, and it's kind of gone up and down. This isn't a steady increase. This is a fairly consistent, or somewhere around 100, 125 new housing starts every year. Bear in mind that the ones at the area between those two lines is all the other electoral areas, which includes the ones up at the lake. And the ones up at the lake are primarily being sold to that retiree or pre-retiree age group, which is why we're seeing no increase in, we're seeing and projecting very little increase in the lake zone. In the south here, though, a continuation of growth, and the question becomes, I think, how fast is. In the last few years, there's been a number of housing developments which have come onto the market and slowly added houses, but they've always added them outside of that Mill Bay area, not right in. This is the development which is right in the middle. This is the Stonebridge development. Just for your orientation here, this is Kerry Park. This is the playing field of Kelsey. Kelsey will be about there. This G is the is the Tibbles. This is the road that goes up Shorey Lake. This is Trinity's here. So it's this whole area in the back here. Eventually, about 700 units, and at some stage that will come online. And the anticipation of the CVRD planning is that probably first house is on market about 2019. They've resolved all their sewage and water supply and servicing issues. So the question becomes the degree of affordability. Are these going to be affordable to families with children, or are they going to be much more top end? The feeling is that the CVRD is going to push them to be as affordable as possible, and that size of development certainly opens the opportunity for a school site in there if that were what you wanted to do. And that's an interesting, and that's going to be a significant development. Up at Lake Cowichan, as I say, continued minor developments, almost exclusively focused on retirees and pre-retirees. Now, this is the interesting area. This is the that south end of North Cowichan, and the North Cowichan planning people and council, I'm sure, have very strong growth management focus, but in the next few years, that Bell-McKinnon corridor will open up. The local area plan for that kind of half got started this year and got put off till next year so that there could be more complete community consultation. And the hospital has purchased that land out there. That's been rezoned to institutional. So all the kind of the push points for the start of the development of that area, and I know I've talked about that area in previous times here, but it's much closer. That will, there could be 5,000, the planning department anticipating there could be 5,000 people eventually accommodated in that area, the Bell-McKinnon area. That probably translates into anywhere between about 400 plus kids. So the need to think and the need to be part of the planning process for that area as it evolves. Down in the south, we have the University Village local area plan, and it's going to have opportunities for both rental and other, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. City of Duncan really has very small scale developments there. In terms of this area, there's 4 major housing developments. These are rental housing, apartments, and townhouses. On Paddle Road there, 120 units, Green Road, 120 plus 64, Sherman Road, and Lewis Road. The top 3, I think, are all in the Drinkwater catchment area, and that could change things a bit there. The Lewis Street is just over here somewhere, and it's a much smaller unit, but much smaller development. But if this becomes a trend and we see more of those kind of developments, if developers think this is a good way of going, then that could change the complexion significantly for schools serving this area. That's Drinkwater, Tanser, Heyman a little bit, all that's kind of a bit farther down there. So, finally, I think, no, almost finally, Maple Bay, a very large area has been already developed on that hillside there, and certainly there's some discussion about continuing that development farther up the hill. but that whole area is much more expensive housing. Although that's not to say there won't be kids coming from that development. But my feeling is a much longer build out, much slower build out for those kind of housing in that kind of area. Finally, the north. It's interesting that there hasn't been much new development there. So the increase in enrollment at Chemainus, for instance, seems to me is coming more from most likely from older people, two persons in a house moving out and a family moving in, as opposed to new development. I anticipate there will be some continued small infill. The debates around big woodland area there, I can't remember the name of it, but that's I think that's behind us now in terms of I was talking to a friend up there. 91% is going to stay as woodland, and 9% is going to be developed for housing, as opposed to some of the original plans, which was to clear the whole lot out for housing. Crofton as well, a tight urban containment boundary. There's a couple of developments there, possible 120, 220 units. The issue there is just the small size of the school anyway. It's not, when you only have a capacity of 175 or whatever. Even another 10 kids, which you could accommodate in Drinkwater with twice the size, it becomes much more difficult to accommodate. And this area, certainly, in terms of facility planning, is going to need some, really careful look at what's going to be happening there. So that's the kind of the enrollment and how housing fits in with that. And of course, I don't have to tell you that things have changed considerably in the last 6 months. And those ripple effects are rippling their way, as it were, through. I was talking to a guy in the recreation department in Victoria who was bemoaning the fact that he had all these parents who were getting kicked out of schools for their daycare programs, and what was the city going to do about it? Good question. So this is the situation, class size, and whatever 22D minimum means, I don't know, but it has some kind of importance. So essentially, we're moving to a system where the capacity of a school is not based on the number of classrooms, but based on the number of kids who you can fit in the classroom, and that's a factor of class size and composition of the number of special needs kids. So essentially, we're moving from a fixed number to a variable number. And that's a little complicated. It complicates things, and so we need to kind of work through this a bit. So let me just, I started working with Jason on this in June, I guess, and then so in September, I actually went to 3 of the schools, Chemainus, Bench, and Drinkwater. Walked around the school, looked at the school, looked at how the composition had changed from last year to this year, how the enrollment had changed, how they were accommodating. And these are some of my thoughts. Clearly, and I don't expect this to be in any way a surprise to you guys. So let me just whip through them. More split classes, potential for constant reorganization. Smaller class sizes in schools with more special needs kids. Some with spare capacity in the past disappearing, which has impacted how they deal with out of boundary, out of area kids. So we've got a much tighter overall system for parents. Gee, I guess I can't send my kid over here or over there, or and impacts both popular schools and those who've historically lost kids to other schools. So some schools have come down a bit, and some have gone up a bit. Drinkwater, Calhalem, various examples of that, I'm sure, across the district. Specialist classrooms are being pressed into use as enrolling classrooms. It struck me that they hung on to their music rooms, but I'm not sure how long they can hang on to them, and just across the whole school, everything was being squeezed, Can district itinerant staff and others work effectively out of cupboards? Because they are at the moment. And I put this in here more for as a reminder to you when you go, or to Jason when he goes to talk to the ministry. This isn't just about putting 4 portable classrooms out the back. Everything in the school is tighter. Where do I meet with parents? Where do I, So juggling space even more challenge. Meeting with parents, finding storage spaces. Storage has always been a problem in schools. Now that storage cupboard is occupied by the, by the ESL or EFL or whatever. Those people, portables and portable squeeze site size. Drinkwater used to have this nice area on one side, and so all that movement of kids, the primary kids used to use this area. Now the elementary, intermediate kids come around there, and then you go. Glad I'm not a principal. And the loss of community spaces. Chemainus was the best example of that. Probably we're a community school, and suddenly we're turfing the community out. We're not, but we're doing our best to accommodate that. So those are some of the thoughts, and how that ripples through. This is Chemainus, and so this is on the left-hand side. These numbers are part of a much bigger spreadsheet I have of all the schools and all the spaces. So essentially, starting at the top, the ministry used to have what it called the nominal capacity, which was calculated on kindergarten 20, elementary 25. I'm just dealing with elementary schools here. And that gave Chemainus an enrollment of 40 plus 325. And then the ministry accepted that some of those spaces were needed to be used for other purposes, so they had the operating capacity, which brought that down. So Chemainus came down to 38 to 303. It has 13 elementary classrooms, 2 kindergarten classrooms, and I've split that roughly between primary and intermediate. That may or may not be correct. And then it had a bunch of other spaces there. This is a square meter for the library, the communal lab, multi-purpose, and special ed. But now we have a revised capacity and we have a minimum and a maximum. And the minimum is if there were loads and loads of special needs kids in that school, then we're going to that 22D minimum number. And those are for kindergarten 15, primary 17, intermediate 24. But if we have a school with no special needs kids, then we go to the other end, which is the maximum, which is kindergarten 20, primary 22, and intermediate 30. And you can see on the minimum, the capacity of the school. This is grades 1 to 7. For this, I've dropped off the kindergarten. So we have a minimum of 270 and a maximum of 342. So now, in fact, the maximum is above the old operating. So in some ways, those new figures say, well, we actually can squeeze more kids in that school. Whereas the minimum certainly says we come down from the old ministry operating down to the new minimum based on class size. At the same time, we've got some changes, that ripples through the school. So Chemainus, for instance, in 2015, 277 in K-7, 11 divisions. We've gone to 12 divisions. And we've gone to now, this year, to 17 divisions. That's a lot more class space we have to find there. I guess I covered all that in the past ministry, now based on past. So, so in my discussions with Rod and Jason, you know, we need to see if we can figure out what the capacity of the school is. What's the most likely capacity? And so we looked at the number of low incidence, high incidence behaviour, special needs kids. Now this is for last year, and I've used last year because I suspect the numbers for this year aren't yet really solid. We told the ministry how many, I think, in one of those million forms, you know, that we send off. You know, I was surprised they were all lower than last year. I didn't know where all those special needs kids from last year had disappeared to or what had happened there. So I'm using last year because I think it's better to err on the high side rather than the low side. So this is the number of special needs kids in each of all the schools, and so I put a score on those: low incidence 6, behaviour 4, and high incidence 2. And that's in order to create another chart, which is to be able to express that score as a percentage of the 2016 enrolment. And then I've sorted those based on that percentage figure. So it comes as no surprise to me to see that the two schools at the bottom with the lowest score, the fewest number of special needs kids are in fact the two French immersion schools. So those schools are going to, because of their class size, their capacity, assumed capacity, is going to be closer to the maximum number, whereas the schools at the top, like Cowichan, Chemainus, Cahaman, have a higher score, and those are going to be closer to the minimum number. Okay? So what does this mean in terms of rolling that through in terms of the relationship between the most likely capacity based on the number of special needs kids. So here we had that same number at the top, the nominal and operating, and then the most likely, the special needs score, the most likely capacity is these kind of orange numbers, and these figures at the bottom are the projected enrollments through to 2029. And what I've done is color code them. If it's white, then there's really not going to be much of a problem. So the space there now is going to still be space as enrollment increases. Yellow means, you know, well, we're over the minimum, but we're still not. There'll still be space if we end up in the most likely. Here, this kind of orange is key. We're this enrollment number, projected enrollment, is now over the most likely, so we're definitely kind of getting into some problems with space there. And red is, well, now we're over the maximum number, so there's certain to be a problem. So, you know, that's and these numbers that add up over to the total figure on the right-hand side. So this is for the center zone, and there's capacity there overall. The ministry will always ask you what can you shuffle boundaries around, can you do things there? Certainly there's going to be problems at Drinkwater and Alex Aitken. They're probably at capacity now, and it's just going to get worse as the enrollment goes up. Probably, you might run into some problems at Maple Bay and Tanser eventually, but probably not immediately. And Calhayman is probably, because it doesn't have a lot of growth coming there. And the same at Alexander. But the caveat I would put in there is, I don't know the degree to which that issue of out-of-boundary students, if indeed those two schools have historically lost kids who could go to Drinkwater or Alex Aitken, and now they can't, they're going to stay at those schools, so in fact those enrollment projections may well go up. So, I'm happy to come back next year. You know, but that's kind of really, so in the central zone, some short-term issues at Drinkwater and Aitken. Longer term, the zone will experience capacity issues, but these can be likely addressed through the eventual upgrading or replacement of schools. So bear in mind, this is over the next 10 years. You're going to have some ongoing upgrading. If you're going to renovate a school, then it's going to be possible, much easier to add a couple of classrooms on at that stage, all that kind of stuff, which which is part of the regular maintenance and upgrading program. However, future housing growth in the south end of North Cowichan, that University Village, north to Belkin, may require additional school capacity in the longer term. So, so that's something to be planned for, but isn't. I don't think you need to worry about the next 5 years. So that's the centre zone. In the south, the first thing that's evident there is it's a lot more red. The red is particularly at Bench and Discovery, and in the whole, in the whole zone. Bonner, which clearly used to be a middle school, junior, secondary, whatever you call it. There's still some spare capacity there, but over time that will get eaten up. So definitely, in the medium term, there'll be need for another elementary school in this area. And I say that because of these numbers down here. You're going to be missing at the most likely capacity around 170 kids by 2029. If there's more special needs kids, 284. So that's getting towards school size. Especially when you bear in mind that the capacity, you've still got all those teachers working, those itinerant DSL, EFL working in cupboards. It'd be nice to change a few boundaries and give those guys more space as well. Major housing development to occur in the Millway area. Mentioned that, but possibility of a school site there. Elsewhere, smaller developments in the short term. Bonner will have some capacity, but plans need to be drawn up, addressing overcapacity at Bench and Discovery. So that's the south zone. In the lake, not really a likelihood of much of a problem there. Although, bear in mind that those two schools, if I went back to that kind of league table of special needs scores, those schools were well up towards the top of that league table, as it were. So, the likely capacity is much closer to the minimum there. So, but probably, not a lot of issues there. In the north zone, once again, a lot of red and coming real soon. At both, there's some spare capacity at Thetis. Good. Those parents that Cheryl was meeting with the other day will be happy to know. But clearly, a large number of special needs students. What more can I say? Additional space is going to be required there, and some of those other variables like St. Joe's. French immersion, hard to project, largely policy controlled. This is really up to you to decide whether you want to have another program. This is an easy one, not easy, but it's quite possible to cap that off at the 90 kindergarten kids they have at the present time, which is it's about 20 or 30 below where they have been in the past. So you can manage those numbers there. Some concern in future years as class sizes. I guess it's going to be one of the interesting things about this change is it's going to be interesting to see how parents react to it. So in the past, it was, I could always, guilty as charged, I started my daughter at the French immersion school, and because I just knew that the quality of environment there, because there was very few disruptive kids in the class, and just as a parent, I was aware of that, and class sizes were pretty much the same across the schools, across the elementary schools. That's going to change, because now schools which have more special needs are going to have lower class sizes, and in the intermediate years, those French immersion schools are going to be kind of still up at the 30 kids. Gee, now as a parent, I'm saying, well, class sizes have gone down everywhere. Why haven't mine gone down, in my French immersion class? Now, is that going to have a ripple effect on parents' assessment of whether to put their kids in the French immersion as opposed to the local neighborhood school? Given that it's always a kind of, well, gee, I have to drive, him or her there every morning. There's always a lot of factors which go into that decision. And this is just one more which is going to, I think, bias a few parents towards sticking with the neighborhood school as opposed to the French immersion. So so there's some questions around that as well. And I think that's about the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer all the questions that you might have.
Wow, that's a lot of material. When do you hope to finish your final report?
Well, I did say the end of this week, but I'll say the end of next week.
Oh, okay.
I think my agreement with Jason was by the end of the month.
And how is that document provided us? Is it a digital document, or is this something that goes online, or whose property is it?
Well, it'll be the board's property. The board will need likely to receive that formally at a board meeting so that they take ownership of it, and then at that point it will be up to the board to distribute as they wish. So I think in the next couple of weeks, Bob will have that ready for the board to receive. This is certainly, I think, a great deal of what the content is that's just been presented tonight, but I know there's more to it. Bob's got some other charts and backup documents and appendices that will accompany the report.
Yeah, but there'll be nothing in the report that I haven't talked about today.
Any other questions?
Well, just, I don't know if you can give us an answer around, you mentioned 4 schools, or 6 schools that need attention, as well as some possible other areas that might drive us toward needing a new school. Where do you start? I mean, do you have an idea about timelines on any of this, or?
Well, I think the next step in your process here, demographics are great, but you need to turn this into some kind of facility plan, which and I think on your in your strategic plan, a 10-year facility plan is really the next step. So you can turn each of these, you can take this data and turn that into statements for the Ministry of the facility requirements for the district over the next 10 years, 10, 12 years.
And I think it's also a very, very useful document as the board begins conversations with the local governments around future school space. Exercising that provision in the Municipal Act to request that school sites be set aside in development. Now you have an idea of where the development is likely to occur and where the population is likely to occur. So that aligns well with that objective, as well as the 10-year facilities plan, which is can now be created because now there's a view out population-wise and area-wise. So it's going to be a great starting point for that.
I live in the South End, and so what I've noticed is there's a lot of large properties that have sold recently between Mill Bay and the top of the Malahat, and those are in our school district.
the idea that we've been told down there is that they will be subdivided, and is that a concern?
The statistics I use assume a continuation of past trends. So if there has been a dozen of those large properties which are going to be developed, which have been developed on average into 50 lots, and that is going to continue, then that is already built into the projections here. What is not built into the projection is if double that number of lots are sold. Then there will be, then we need to accommodate in the housing piece to that. But my anticipation is that, it's firstly that the key thing is affordable housing. I had a very interesting conversation with one of the planners at North Cowichan. And being the kind of person I am, I said, "So how many kids do you have?" He said, "Well, my wife and I don't have any kids yet, but we would really like to." "Oh, do you own a house?" He said, "We've been trying to buy a house for the last 2 or 3 years since we moved here." He was, I think, in his early 30s. And he said, "But every summer we go looking for a house and it's gone up. We've saved a bit more money. Affordability of housing is going to be absolutely critical, or else you are going to, and if housing continues to be unaffordable, for those kind of young people, these aren't teachers, these are people whose family income is well over $100,000, but unless they have, bank of mum and dad behind them, then they can't afford the down payment for the property. So that family housing gets bought up by someone from Alberta who's retiring, who's 55, with a spouse or 65 and there's no kids. So in fact, it's really the affordability of housing which becomes the absolute critical issue, and that's that's an enormous issue which is on the agenda of lots of governments, and it's an issue which is hard for local government to control, but they would be much more likely to control that if indeed they know that they have the school board strongly behind them, saying that that bringing kids into this, allowing kids to grow up in our community is an essential part of our community, and you guys, ex-mayors of Ladysmith, need to do their damnedest to make sure housing is affordable. But I don't have to tell the chair how difficult that can be.
Thank you. Trustee Smith?
So with this information that Bob's just given us, would that trigger a report of all of the facilities that we still own to see what is viable to turn back into a school or to upgrade it or whatever aids? Will that now trigger a report of what we have?
I think so. I think also reviewing the report as a board, possibly at a future board planning session, and maybe even having Bob back through that exercise would be really valuable as well. And certainly this is a big overview. You need some time to digest the data. We need some time to digest the data and plan with the data, and then come back to the report, possibly with Bob's assistance, and really start to look at what it means for the district.
And I think one of the things you asked me to do originally was to look at those properties, so I need to include that in the report.
Excellent. Thank you.
The impact of Bill 28, the demonstration of Cheminos, where year over year went up 21 kids, and you added one division, went up with 35 kids, and we added 5 divisions. Has it literally thrown all our past projections out the window in terms of space? And it sounds like perhaps successfully calculating in all 3 other regions of the valley. It's starting from scratch again.
We've had we've had 10 years at least of the ministry saying you've got to get to 100% of capacity before we'll even think about new space. And with a stroke of a pen, we've now reduced the capacity of schools by, 10, 20% in some cases. And the fact, and it's causing some problems. I don't know to tell you that, Yeah, and it's having, it's not just School District 79 which has that problem. I would think every school district, oh no, that's probably not true, but lots of school districts in the province have that problem. All the big ones, all the ones in areas like Cowichan which are attractive. Probably if I went to Quesnel or North Peace, maybe less, but still. There's going to be a lot of competition for capital dollars.
Mr. Simquist?
One of the things that Bob has done in his report here, which is really interesting and we haven't seen from the ministry, is create a weighting or an indexing of our complexity of our special needs students for the purposes of developing. So we model of behavior is ×4, high incidence times 2, to create a weighting to really identify which schools will have the most impact from composition issues. And I think that's a really, really important piece because that shows us which schools are most heavily impacted and which schools therefore have the most heavily impacted capacity levels. And I think that's a model really worth sharing with the Ministry of Education. I don't know if you've got their heads around that yet.
Trustee Croft?
You and I and Rod did have that conversation, and I think Rod said, once we've got the report, we'll initiate that discussion. And it's the complexity is, I'm sure if I asked, Cheryl, which of the schools would be most affected by that, you'd be able to tell. You would have been able to tell me with no great problem. What we've done here is we've now wrapped capacity into that and future projections into that, which gives you a much better case to make to the ministry.
Trustee Croft?
In terms of affordable housing, the rule of thumb seems to be if you build it, they will come in terms of young families. So can you give us any linkage between having affordable housing and having the economy in which those young families can thrive? Does one always follow the other, or?
Well, of course, there's two things that a young family need, or at least two. One is affordable housing, the other is a job. So what you're really asking is what's the relationship between those?
Yes.
And I think the first thing to say is that you're going to find it much easier in this region to keep young professionals here if indeed you have affordable housing for them. So for instance, that teacher who's just come from somewhere, or that planner, or that nurse, or that doctor, they're much more likely to stay here if indeed they can buy a house as opposed to rent a house. So the planner that I was talking about, they currently rent a house. Well, I'm much less likely to stay in a region if I'm only renting, because someone's going to offer me a job in Salmon Arm, and I can afford to buy a house up there and live there. So I think that the affordable housing helps young professionals cement themselves in the community much more firmly, and I think that becomes the next piece that comes along is the education piece. If you can cement those young professionals in in an affordable house and the kids are in school and happy, then I'm much more likely to stay in that job even if I'm not so happy, because the upheaval, we've all been through those things. I moved to Victoria, age 31. I'm still there, and that's partly because Victoria happens to be a very nice place, but it's also because once my kids were in school and we had the house, and so I think it's that relationship which is the key. I think the other side of it, and if there's a fourth dimension, it's community life, and I think schools play a critical role there, as well. And I think that's one of the great tragedies of this change, that the space for community life in the school is disappearing, because that's a key part of a community. Where's the scout group meet, where the Cubs meet, where's the Quilters Guild, all those other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that make community life.
Well, I see no other hands up, so thank you very much for your presentation and the fascinating information you provided us. So looking forward to the final report. I'm sure we're going to be seeing more of you as we work our way through it.
I'm more than happy to help. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No report from education, business and operations. Mr. Sanchez.
Thank you. Just one final remaining item on the agenda. On October 20th, we were to report out to the Ministry of Education on the impacts of the classroom, the impacts of the implementation of LOU 17. And there's been some adjustments from the initial request that was submitted in May earlier this year. So what I've shown up here is just a summary of the changes. What we had to do is recalculate what our schools would look like if we were back in the 16-17 language. So some schools had enrollment growth, so not all of our new teachers are coming from the Classroom Enhancement Fund. Some are coming just simply because the numbers increased. So we used Beauregard to regenerate those classes. And so overall, we are up 42.69 elementary teachers simply because of the LOU 17. We've applied to the ministry now for those. Up 22.244 in secondary. Again, due to LOU 17, so a total of almost 65 teachers just due to in the classroom and the enrolling side due to the implementation of the LOU. Now enrollment is up from the September 30th count, and part of that is not all school-based enrollment. Some of that is our dual credit and DL programs claiming students in September, which previously would have been claimed in either potentially February or May due to funding protection. And they affect the ratios, which affect the non-enrolling ratios as well. So we're higher in the September count, which means we're going to be lower probably in the February and May, and need to adjust our funding model to reflect that once we figure out what the difference is. So you can see the big change here. Again, these aren't changes from where we were in May. They're just what we've asked for applications. So we're up a little bit in teacher librarians. I think that's about a 0.2 or 0.3 over where we were before, and that's due to the ratio change. I think actually it's 0.2. So we're now roughly almost 4 teacher librarians. That's our big ratio that we were not on with the LOU 17. Up a bit in counseling. Learning assistance is up by almost about 0.2, and English as a second language. So some of these have been posted. I think the ESL 0.3 is out. Others are about to be once we determine where they're going to end up. So I had to wait for the 1701 to really understand what some of these ratios were going to be, and now we have a little bit of catch up to do in compliance. So in total, just over 70 teachers out of the Classroom Enhancement Fund. Now the average salary, as we've calculated it, is just under $96,000 across the district. So the initial claim was closer to 100 when we put it in. It's dropped due to new hires, and we spread that across the funds. So we're waiting to Okay, this just went in, but we're waiting to get approval for that. We also made contact with the ministry regarding the overhead component and have submitted a revised overhead amount. So we're hopeful that we'll get some additional overhead funding. They were open to that idea. I don't know if that's a change in government. We were analytically, we showed the ministry that we were the third lowest funded district in the province on the overhead side, and so have calculated with reasons and resubmitted in a number of different areas in hopes of bringing in additional funding to support those overhead expenses. They seemed open to that, to the receipt of our revision, and we'll share that when we have more information from them. Hope to talk to them about that tomorrow a little bit as well.
Thank you. I have two questions. In terms of the 42 additional teachers at the elementary level, is that 42 additional classrooms as well?
Those are classroom teachers.
And then the secondary level, is that also equivalent of 22 more classroom spaces?
Yeah, with the 42.69, that's inclusive of the prep time as well, so probably a little bit less when you actually look at the number of classrooms. But prep time is I think in the secondary that would be actual classrooms.
And the special education resource teachers,
Right.
what is happening there?
So no additional claim. Within that count, we're able to count a lot of the extra services that are outside of the resource teachers, such as speech language and others, into the total. So the formula doesn't generate more than the district was already providing. So that's why you see just a blank number there. The formula would say that the board needs 22.81. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4 or something. And now we already have 38.1 when we added everything that's considered to be acceptable in that category. So we're not able to claim for additional resources.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Sanquist? Great. Anything else to add?
No, that concludes the report.
Anything on policy? No? Too much golf or what?
I'm kind of withdrawing a little bit from it, but.
Oh, that's okay.
Golf or policy?
Why golf? Yeah, it's been raining.
Okay. No other business. Motion to adjourn. Trustees Pillsbury, trustee Smith. All those in favor?